Vanoggend gesels ek met Mervyn Abrahams en hy is van die Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity. Mervyn, welkom by GROOTplaas. Ons kan skakel tussen Afrikaans en Engels, maar welkom en dankie vir jou tyd vanoggend.
Baie dankie Maya en baie goeiemôre aan al die luisteraars.
Ek dink as ons kyk na kospryse, if we look at food prices at the moment, what is happening? What's going on?
So Maya, what we have been seeing in our household affordability index, the food basket in that index, which contains 44 very basic foods that most low-income and working-class households would purchase on a monthly basis, then we continue to see that the cost of the basket is increasing. We had a slight dip in June, but in July, we saw again a slight increase of about 25 Rand on the cost of that basket, which now brings the basket to over 5,000 Rand. Now, different foods show different levels of inflation. So when we look at meat prices, we look at beef, for instance, we track the cost of 2 kilograms of beef. Then we have seen that beef prices have consistently come down over the last 3 months, and that at the moment we are looking at the beef price at consumer retail level being 5% cheaper than it was a year ago. If we look also at wors, sausage, which of course for most South Africans are very important.
Yes,
absolutely. It is also a little cheaper now. It's about 1% cheaper than it was a year ago. And we're seeing almost a similar trend with regard to chicken prices. But then when we look into the basket at, for instance, the vegetable prices, and particularly potatoes and onions, which are perhaps the two most important vegetables that households purchase, then we see massive increases in the cost of those two. So for instance, we've seen a 10 kg pocket of potatoes is now about something like 48% more expensive than it was a year ago. And a 10 kg of onions is about 81% more expensive than it was a year ago. And when we look at maize, for instance, which is really an important staple for most South Africans, then we see that maize prices has also increased by something like 2% over the past year. So within the basket, there are different foods are showing, some foods are showing a decline, other foods are showing increases.
So what are some of the factors at the moment that's playing a role in these up and down and these variabilities? What are we looking at?
So there are a number of factors. So when it comes to meat prices, for instance, we have traditionally seen that during the winter months, which we're in now, that meat prices tends to come down because farmers have taken their stock for slaughter at the beginning of winter. But then when summer arrives, December month, we tend to see an increase in meat prices. So meat prices to us seem to be in the same range that traditionally they've been in, which indicates probably some level of stabilization. When it comes to vegetable prices, particularly the two vegetables I mentioned, onions and potatoes, then of course that is also got to do something with seasonality. But we are in the middle of really important climatic changes. So last year we have seen quite a lot of rainfall. We are now going into periods where we are anticipating possibility of droughts across different parts of South Africa. So climate plays an extremely important role in, of course, agriculture. And then the other factor is, of course, load shedding and not having stable electricity. So farmers are struggling in order to either irrigate their farms or making sure that there is sufficient energy for their needs. And then the third factor, of course, is also transport and logistics. And because we tend to transport food over a very long distance from where the food is grown to where it is sold or eaten, fuel prices play an immense role in actually what we end up with, the prices of food at the retail level. So these are three factors that we believe is playing a role at the moment, because we have seen globally that global commodity prices have come down quite significantly. So these are specific South African factors that are influencing our food prices at the moment.
Mervyn, ek gaan my volgende vraag in Afrikaans sommer net vra, maar as mens kyk na 'n huishoudelike mandjie, spreekwoordelike mandjie as mens praat. Daai natuurlik, sommige mense bly by, die meeste mense bly nie by nie. Wat is julle rol in hierdie hele groter skema? Ek meen natuurlik is ek seker julle is ook 'n stem vir baie wat dalk nie 'n stem het nie in hierdie omstandighede.
Yes, Maya. So essentially our role is to make sure that there is credible research available in the public domain, so that people can see really what the impact is. And Maya, the impact is different across different sectors of South African society.
Absolutely.
Because South Africa has the highest inequality ratio globally. So it depends on where you are located, you know, in the top 10% or in the bottom 60% will impact you differently. Now, for instance, so that's why it's important to have credible data that specifically focus in on the 60%, the lower 60% of the South African economic table. So there it is a question, Maya, of affordability. So it's a question of how much money do I have in my pocket in order to purchase the food that I need. Now, when we look, for instance, at wage levels, we know that about 60% of South Africa's workers earn at the level of the national minimum wage, or in some cases less. Now, the national minimum wage for the month of July would have brought in something in the region of about 4,500 Rand per worker. Now, each worker, because of our unemployment rate, has to support on average 4 persons. Now, when you subtract from that 4,500 your transport cost and your electricity cost, you arrive at a figure of something like 1,800 Rand that is left over. Now, that's for food.
Sure.
Now, when you divide that amongst 4 persons, you arrive at something around 462 or just under 500 Rand per person. Now, that is lower than the food poverty line set by National Treasury, which is in the region of about 600, etc. So we can see really the impact of high food prices on low income or middle or low income households, because they just do not have the money in order to purchase the food at these prices. Now, we also have to say that food prices are going to fluctuate because it's dependent on weather, it's dependent on imports. You know, we import a lot of fertilizer, we import fuel, so you're always going to have fluctuation in food prices. And in other economies, how households manage that difference is based on their savings.
Yes.
Now, in South Africa, we have the problem where the majority of households do not have any savings. And so when you see situations like this where food prices escalate, then they have no other means but to cut back on their level of consumption because they have no savings that can carry them through. And cutting back on consumption has other massive socio-economic implications and economic implications for Africa in its future. So it's not really a good thing to do. So we really have to bring prices down whilst at the same time begin to look at levels of wages, particularly in the post-COVID period when many workers have not had any increases anyway.
Mervyn, I'm thinking now, so what, let's say worst case scenario, people literally can't afford food. What is the plan B? What should be done? What is the alternative if we reach a point where people, they literally can't afford food anymore?
So Maya, there are different levels of intervention. It seems to us the most serious intervention or the short-term intervention is for government support around, for instance, the child support grant, for instance. We know that that grant works extremely well, but it is too little at the moment, you know. So it's something in the region of about 500 Rand, while it costs about 600 Rand to feed a child. So can we at least bring that grant to the level of what it costs to feed a child a sufficient and nutritious meal? So government support in the intermediate stage, government support in terms of social security. Then in terms of the long term, because social security cannot continue to increase, we're actually going to have to think about shifting the way our food system operates. Maya, I mentioned to you that we transport food over immensely long distances. For instance, tomatoes are mainly grown in Limpopo and is sold in Durban and Cape Town. You can well imagine the amount of fuel used to transport that.
Yes.
So we are going to have to localize and find more localized food systems around our cities. When we look, for instance, at the food basket, city by city, and we tend to look at the city of Cape Town, then generally speaking, the food basket in Cape Town tends to be a little cheaper. And this is largely because of the agriculture around the metro of Cape Town, as well as within the metro of Cape Town. So, for instance, fresh vegetables in the Filipino horticultural area, etc. So you cut out, you know, this long distances, for instance. So that's one area we are going to have to look at, but that will take years to change. In the meantime, we would need kind of government support, as well as keep our eye on why these prices are increasing. So this is another area that we really have to look at, because
Mervyn,
you know,
Mervyn, sorry to interrupt you. I think we're going to need another day and another morning to just continue our chat. But thank you for your passion, and thank you so much for all the knowledge. I really appreciate it this morning.
Thank you, Maya.
Dankie dat jy ingeskakel het. Ek kan nie glo ons is so vinnig uit tyd uit nie. Ek hoop jy het 'n lekker dag. Ek en jy sien mekaar môre weer.